one of the things that we're really working hard on is to improve math instruction for your children. We know that there are concerns across the province. We do quite well in our board compared to other boards in the province, but with the kids that we have in front of us every day that you give us, we don't do well enough. So one of the things that we've committed to is not only improving instruction for your children, but also engaging parents. So in the next hour, these are the things that we're going to talk about, because the session is called Kids Don't Know Their Facts. And it's a pretty catchy title, it got you here. Because this is a question that we hear often in the media. We hear it from parents about kids not knowing their facts. And I'm going to talk a lot about what that really means. So what are the facts that kids need to know? How are our children, or how are your children, learning their facts? And then how might I support my child? So those are the questions, hopefully, that you'll have answered by the time you leave tonight. I want to start with a very simple concept, and that's the concept of addition. And one of the things that we talk about with facts is how you learn the facts versus how your children are learning the facts. And if you can remember back to where you were really, really small, you did not come into school in kindergarten and have a worksheet put in front of you with the numbers 7 plus 8, 4 plus 1. What you did as a child was you started to explore things and you played. That's what our children do, that's what your children do. So let's think about the concept of addition. What will happen with children, and think of your youngest children or try to think back of when your children were young. They might have been playing with some cars and they counted 2 cars. And they might have counted another 3 cars. And they might have put them together, and they were starting to understand that when they put things together, they got more. So when they're counting those cars, they might count 1, 2. They might then count 1, 2, 3. They put them together, and what do? They count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what they're doing is they're developing an understanding of counting and addition. And what that's called, there's a technical term for it, it's called counting 3 times. I had to count the 2, I had to count the 3. When I put them together, I counted them all again, and I got 5. Now, when kids are small, that takes up a lot of space in their brain. And there's a lot of research around, it's a concept called compression. So that's a lot for a little child to think about. Eventually, they start to represent that with number. And they write things like 2 plus 3 equals 5. They may need to count the cars. They may not need to count the cars. Think of yourself. When you see that, you know that 2 plus 3 is 5. It's an automatic fact for you. It doesn't take up any space in your brain. That concept of addition that's so big for little kids is now compressed in your brain. And that's called fluency. You're able to recall the fact without even thinking about it. How many of you are okay with 2 plus 3 is 5? Right? It doesn't take anything for you to think about that fact. You know it. You don't need to count things out. But that's not how any of us learned that fact. We had to learn what it meant to put things together, and that's called a conceptual understanding of addition. So what are the facts that kids need to know? How do they know the facts, and how do they learn them? So is it a conceptual understanding, or is it procedural fluency? And I'm going to talk a lot about that last bit at the end, because you're probably going, what is she talking about? So I want you to think about the facts kids need to know. What would you expect your kids to know? What facts do you want your kids to know? Multiplication tables. Which ones? So when you say up to 12, do you mean 12 times 12? Yeah. How many of you think that that would be probably good? If your kids knew by the end of elementary school or by about grade 7, they could do 12 times 12. We all agree. I agree. Okay, but those are facts that we want our kids to know. So along with multiplication comes division as well, right? So when we say 12 times 12, we're also thinking about 144 divided by 12. We want them to be able to know those relationships between multiplication and division. What about addition and subtraction? You want your kids to know 4-digit addition?
Oh, double digits.
Double-digit addition? So you're close. We really only need our kids to know how to add and subtract to 20 as facts. But I want kids to be able to add large numbers together. So think of this question. 743 plus 962. That's not a fact we know. That's not a fact we recall. That is addition. We need to understand what addition is, and we need to be able to work with those numbers and be able to add them. That's what we all do. Some of us are sitting in the audience and going, I know that fact, and you probably do. Some of us know, I know how I would do that, but it's not a fact that I would recall. So if we think about mathematics in society and we see this thing around kids not knowing their facts, we see that in the paper all the time. Our math program is struggling because kids don't know their facts. Those facts that they really need to know and be able to recall are the 12 by 12 and adding and subtracting to 20. Well, if that makes us good mathematicians, that's pretty empty. If that's all we had to teach in mathematics in school, we'd be done really early. So think about that and think about what your kids think means being good at math. What does it mean to be good at math? If it's just about recalling facts, that's not very much of mathematics. Not saying that we don't want our kids to be able to recall those facts. So let's go through how we're doing it. So this is a copy of the curriculum. And in the curriculum, and you'll see that in the blue handout that I've given you, there are 5 strands in mathematics. And tonight we're talking about number sense. How do kids work with numbers, specifically those fact pieces? There's so much more to the math curriculum that your children are participating in. There's patterning and algebra. There's geometry and spatial sense. There's measurement. But guess what? They're dealing with those numbers all the time. They're working with number. So number sense flows through. In our curriculum, there are very few expectations around the facts that we just talked about. And I'm going to show you a more clear picture. In grade 3, students are learning to multiply. The expectation at the end of grade 3, so if you have children in grade 3, they need to be able to multiply up to 7 by 7. And then there's the division piece, 49 divided by 7. In grade 4, multiply to 9 by 9. You'll see that multiply by 10 is also in grade 4, but it talks about multiplying by 10, multiplying by 100, multiplying by 1,000. And you'll also see adding and subtracting. Again, these are very small expectations within the curriculum, but they come across number every day. So what are some of the things that you see up there in terms of, besides the numbers, what's that common phrase that's in those curriculum documents? Yes? Using a variety of mental strategies. So there's a big piece. Mental math is not fact recall. Mental math is having a picture of how those numbers work in your head and being able to draw on what that means. So I'm going to show you what that means. I'm going to have you read this quote. I don't need to read it to you. So that goes back to that idea of compression. If every set of numbers you ever worked with was something that you had to memorize, there's not enough space in anyone's brain. Think about when you were in high school and you were in math. Some of us were very strong in math. Some of us worked really hard in math and did well. Some of us really struggled through. And we had these exams. And we had all these steps and procedures that we memorized for the test or for the exam. Do you recall what those steps are right now? Do you understand what those concepts are? So the brain will not maintain that if everything that you're doing is a bunch of steps and procedures that don't have understanding. It's not going to stay in your brain. Here's a great study that came out of the United States. And it talks about 7 to 12-year-olds. They were presented with a question, 13 plus 8. And so these are 7-year-olds, they'd be about grade 2. And teachers were asked to put these students in their class into above average, average, below average groups. And I think I should have gone that way for you. I don't agree with naming a student that way, but this is for the purpose of the study. So all of the students in the group got the answer of 21. It's how they got 21 that was different. So the below average group, this is what they did. What are they doing? They're counting? They're counting 13 by ones, right? They're counting 13 plus, is it still going on behind me? Like, it takes a long time. It takes up a lot of work, cognitive ability to count by ones. The average group either knew the fact, so they knew 13 and 8 was 21 immediately, or they did this. What did they do? They started with 13 and counted 8 by 1. And so that's called counting on. So our teachers are not only looking at what kids get as the answer, but how they're doing it. So if I see my kids counting by 1 in grade 7, I have concerns about where they are developmentally in their counting. And so if you have children that are at home right now that are 3 years of age, do not go home and say you can't count by ones. That's important. They need that one-to-one correspondence. So here's the above average group. Do you see 13? It's orange, right? And you see 8? These are called 10 frames, and they're in our classrooms, and it helps kids see 10 at a time. We want kids to see an organization, just as you would if you roll a die and the number 5 comes up, you see 5 immediately. You're not counting each dot. It's called subitizing. So I see 10 immediately. So kids that get 21, that are able to pull numbers apart, so if I take 2 from the 13, I make another 10, I've got 21. So the ability of kids that can pull numbers apart and put them back together is very powerful. And that's what we're working on in our school system. We need to know that kids have the flexibility to make the numbers work for them. Okay? So the question was, is this what we call mental math? Yes. I have a mental understanding or a picture in my head of what 10 looks like. I might not necessarily always have a 10 frame, and there are other tools. I'm going to talk about them today. So when kids are learning to count in school, they have things called 5 frames. And they will build the number to 5, and it's really just half of that 10 frame. So you want to see, does your kid recognize what 5 looks like? Can you have them look at a die, for example? So parent tip, depending on how old your kids are, roll 2 die, ask them what the sum is. It doesn't have to be, okay, I'm going to sit down and do this with you. It might be part of the game. But when you're playing a board game with your kids, how are they counting those die? That gives you some pretty good information. Are they able to see 4 right away? Do they see 4 and then count 1, 2, 3? Do they know 4 and 3 is 7? Those are some good observations as a parent. Okay? So consider that same grouping about below average, average, above average. What happens to kids that get bigger numbers, like 32 plus 48? If they're counting by ones, it's going to take a long time. And how frustrating is that going to be? Right? So I want you to add that in your head. Sorry to put I'm not going to point anyone out and make you answer the question when you don't want to. Don't look away, I won't ask you. How many of you got 80? I've got a really bright group here tonight. All did not get 80 in the same way. Would someone like to share how they got 80? Yes, my dear. So she's broken those numbers apart. She said if I add 2 to 8, I get 10, and if I add that to 30 and 40, I get 80. Great answer. Another way. Sir. So we broke 32 into 30 and 2, built that concept of 10, added it to 48, and then added the 30. Great answer. So the question was, is this a way that a grade 2 could think of it? Grade 2s are starting to work with 2-digit numbers. So it's important to know what the curriculum expectations are in grade 2 and what those numbers are, because they add and subtract numbers to 18 in grade 2. So the numbers that they are working with, it's really important that kids learn to pull numbers apart in manageable numbers that they know before they go to these bigger numbers. This is probably getting close to the end of grade 2, grade 3. So there's different ways. Many of you might have done this. You might have pulled the 30 and 32 and the 48 apart. You've decomposed them. That's called decomposition. So teachers are looking to see which students know how to do decomposition. I think this is your strategy. I might have something called compensation where I add 2 and subtract 2, which really means it's a concept of 0. So there are many ways that kids start to pull numbers apart. And why is that important? Because they have flexibility of working with numbers. And that's what you want your kids to have. Be able to work with the numbers to make them work for them. So I want you to think about something like this. Come home, your child comes home, they bring this to you and they say, I got 5 out of 5 and I'm going to put it on the fridge. What does it tell you? So I'd be asking my child, tell me how you got that answer. Remember, it's not your job to teach all those different strategies, but it's your job to listen to how they got the answer. Because they might have started to count with, if I look at 4 plus 9 is 13, your child might have said, well, I started with 9 and I counted on, because that's more efficient by starting with a bigger number. That tells me a lot about where my child is. I'm going to know that as a teacher, and that's the type of question I'm asking. So when we think about being good at math, real misconception, getting the answer right all the time is not being good at math. If your children come to school and know the answer to every single question, every single day, they've learned nothing. They knew it. They've learned nothing. It's important for children to make mistakes, to learn from the mistakes. That's a silencer. It's important for children to make mistakes and learn from the mistakes. And here's some brain research around that. It talks about synapses and growth of the brain. When you make a mistake, a synapse fires in your brain. When you make a mistake and correct it, you double the synapse growth in your brain. We don't want kids to consistently get wrong answers. We want them to grow from their conceptual understanding where they are and move them forward. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Sir. It's a hard one, and it's something. Did anyone come to my growth mindset session? Oh, okay. So I won't be repeating for many of you. So I did talk about this in terms of a growth mindset for children. It's important that kids see themselves as mathematicians. And the question was around, how do I help my child when she gets frustrated that she doesn't get things right when she doesn't? And one of the things that we need to do as parents is to have the conversations around Do you know that when you make a mistake or when you learn something, your brain grows? That whole thing for kids is very intriguing, and I've seen kids in grade 1 classrooms in our schools understand what that means. I don't get it. I don't get it yet. Okay? As a parent, the one thing that I'd love you to take away is to promise yourself that you're not going to go home and say, it's okay, I wasn't good at math. Because as soon as your child hears that, they're going to say, well, it's okay then, if mom or if dad says they're not good at math, then I'm okay to say that too. And what does it mean to be good at math is a whole societal piece. Because if that means being good at math, I'm not sure that's how we want to value mathematics. Being good at math is listening to how you're changing and being able to work with numbers. That's just one part of math. So we talked about this around being, how do you know your facts? Is it important to memorize your facts? Well, if I memorize and memorize and memorize, I'm not going to have any more room in here. But that automaticity, you don't memorize 2 plus 3. You automatically know that. You could see a picture of it in your head if you had to. So think about the automaticity of a fact. It relies on knowing the relationships. So if I see 2 plus 3, do I know what 2 and 3 would look like on a die? Absolutely. Could I put them together? Yes. I have that automaticity. So how do you memorize your facts? Is it important to know your facts? I think we've all agreed it is, right? We want our children to know those multiplication tables. We want them to be able to add and subtract to 20. Rote drill is not going to help anybody learn the facts. Rote drill is actually, there's a lot of research right now around how it's not helping kids. And when I talk about rote, I'm talking about let's all stand up and just, we're going to drill the facts. There is no speed in the curriculum. It doesn't say you have to do this many fact recalls in a certain amount of time. Mathematicians spend weeks on one problem. Mathematicians are slow and methodical in many senses. So this is PISA, and I don't know if you've heard of PISA. It's an international study, and they look at mathematics, they look at reading, and they look at science around the world. And we actually, Ontario is on the PISA, and one of the things with PISA is they're finding that the students that are achieving the lowest are those that are focusing on the memorization. So we want our kids to be able to recall. It's not the memorization piece that we want. Now, how many of your kids are in grade 4 or higher? So they're working on multiplication. They're starting to work on multiplication, those fact pieces, and you're a parent and you really think it's important for your kids to be able to recall 7 times 6. Right? You want them to do that because it's going to help them as they go on in school. And in the old days, we used to have, like, I taught grade 4, my very first year of teaching, I had the kids' names up on the wall, and I put a sticker beside them when they knew all the 7 times tables, or all the 6 times tables. Well, that's probably not an effective strategy for making kids feel that they can or cannot do mathematics nowadays, but I do need to know what facts they know. As a parent, take a times table chart. If they're in grade 4, take up to 7 times 7. Grab a bingo dabber and have your child dab the ones they know. So I know 7 times 1 is 7. They dab it. You're going to find a lot of those they know. But guess what? That 7 times 8 one, when it comes down, oh my goodness, I keep forgetting that one. Well, then ask them, what's 7 times 8 in the car? What's 8 times 7? Work with that fact. They're memorizing that fact, but they have to understand multiplication. So my first question is going to be, what does 2 times 3 mean? And hopefully your child will say, well, it's 2 groups of 3. And what's that the same of? Well, it might be the same as 3 groups of 2. They need to know those pieces, but if there's a 7 times 8 and they just can't keep recalling it, then say, let's go through them. What's 7 times 8? There's nothing wrong with doing that. But do they understand that means 7 groups of 8? That's a huge piece. Ready for some math? Yes is the answer. So I want you to think about, if you had a pencil and paper, how you would do this question. Anyone do this? So you probably have, when you're thinking about it, and you're going to sit down with your child and you're going to show them. You're going to show them what you know and how you did this. And you're going to talk about borrowing something from your neighbor. There is no neighbor. That's a rule and a procedure. That's a rule that means nothing to kids. I'm going to borrow from my neighbor. If you were really smart, you crossed out 300 and made it 299 and added one. It's like, these are rules. They're things that you know. Ask your child what they know about those numbers. What does subtraction mean? That's a pretty big question. We want our kids to think about subtraction, really. That means, what's the distance between 300 and 287? So think of that thing up there behind me. It's called a number line. And I want to see kids in my classrooms, which are your classrooms, which are our classrooms. I want to see them starting at 287. I want to say, okay, if I add 3, I'm going to get to 290, and then add another 10, I'm going to get to 300. So I've just done a mental picture in my head. It's 13. I know that answer. It's pretty fast. Now, I don't want you to think that we're not teaching algorithms anymore. So an algorithm is that big, ugly thing, right? We have these things where we're borrowing because we can't subtract. We are getting to that. But if that's the first thing we go to teach kids, borrow from the neighbor, it's all over the map. What does it mean? And then here's another piece. Some of you have kids that think very quickly with numbers. Or you might have done this as a child. The answer to this question is 13. You put down 13 and the teacher says, show me your work. Well, I know it's 13. So they're going to make you force, and our teachers aren't doing this, force you to go back and do that standard algorithm that they know. How about just throwing a number line on? Show my work? Okay, here it is. It's this. I can show you. It's the distance between these. I'm done. It's pretty powerful. Works for decimals, works for fractions, works for integers. The number line works for all, and it goes all the way to calculus. So it's a great model for kids. So how are they learning their facts? I don't want you to raise your hand, but there are a lot of parents here that want to see lots of sheets come home every day. Okay? So how many numbers, how many sets of questions do you think it would take you to figure out that you know what you're doing with subtracting 2-digit numbers? Probably wouldn't take you very many questions. So this is a question in terms of how many numbers do I need to work with? Is it important for kids to do practice at home? Yes. Sometimes there's some tensions with that. So my daughter, grade 8, math teacher, 18 years, running math for the board. I know nothing. I do not know what I'm talking about. She is my daughter. That's not how we do it. That is never going to change. That is going to come across that table discussion at some point in your life. But there are things that are important. So think about homework. If a child's in school all day long, and they're in a math class, and they're struggling at a problem in a math class, and it goes home for homework, and they didn't know how to do it at school, how's it going to work at home? Or they already knew how to do it. I'm going to do more of it at home, but I already knew how to do it. So what does homework look like? And those are conversations that we're having at the board level. Because it's important to have practice, but it's also important to have a purpose. So think of that last example, 300 subtract 287. If I have a child that can work with those numbers really well, my next question to that child, being a teacher, would be, are there numbers that this doesn't work so well for? So if I have 300 subtract 57, That's a lot of jumping on the number line. Is that the best tool for me to use? Or is there another way? And that's how you start to get towards the algorithm pieces. Okay? So math models are huge. And models, you've seen two already. You've seen the 10 frame, and you've seen the number line. And those models help kids understand how numbers are related. So here's one of my favorite pieces, subtraction. How do we read this number? So you might say 91 subtract 27, 91 less 27, 91 take away 27. Any of those? And how do we write it? In our society, what do? We stack them. And then we start to memorize those steps again, right? So what happens with kids, and you'll see this in lots of classrooms and with your own children, if they don't have a conceptual understanding of what subtraction is, they'll start with the rules. Okay, I go to the right, and I go to subtract 7 from 1. Well, I can't, so I got to borrow from my neighbor, right? Like that I start to get those pieces coming in. But what happens is kids say, well, I can't take 7 from 1, but I can take 1 from 7. And it's not about what that means anymore. It's about trying to work with those numbers in isolation. And that's really confusing. So there are 3 ways of looking at subtraction. Did you know that? The first way is that take-away idea. And this is probably what most of us go to. So if I look at 91, take away 27, really what that means is I started at 91, and I took away 20, then I took away 5, then I took away 2. I took away 7 in total, 27 in total. That's the takeaway, and that's a model that I would use to represent that. That's probably our go-to one. There's another one called comparison. So the question again is 91, subtract 27. Well, the answer to that question, if you look at those 2 comparison rods, those rectangles, really means what would I have to add to 27 to get to 91? And that's called, so when I think about 91 and 27, what I'm thinking about 91 subtract 27 means, what's the distance between 91 and 27? So I need you right now to put your hands in front of you. This is 91. See how I had to turn around there? This is 91, and this is 27. So the answer to subtraction is the distance between these two. This is what the answer to that question is. There's a distance between us. All right, now what I'd like you to do is to take your hands, and I would like you to move both of those numbers 5 units to your right. Both numbers, 5 units to your right. What's happened to the distance between your hands? The same. It's the same, right? So let's go back. You're at 91 and 27 again. Take it 14 units to the left. What's happened to the distance between you? The hands, it's the same, right? So go back. So right away when I think about that number line, those numbers aren't so easy to work with, especially at 7:30 after a long day of work or being at home all day with kids. The distance between 91 and 27 is pretty difficult to work with. What numbers would be easier to work with? How could I move those numbers? Sir at the back. So I'm going to move both of my hands 3 units over. I'm going to go to 30, and I'm going to go to 94. What's the distance between those 2 numbers? In your head? 64. That's a mental picture. That's an understanding of the concept of subtraction. You've got a mental picture in your head, and you're working flexibly with those numbers. Bingo. You want your kids to be able to work with those numbers like that? You're able to move that 64. Well done. So what does that mean in terms of, remember I said we're going to talk about leading to an algorithm? So at some point we're going to have kids that aren't necessarily working on a number line, that have moved past that piece, and they're going to need to use those tools that we all learned to, you know, cross out and all that stuff, but we call them by, you know, we're talking about tens. We use the proper terminology. So 91 subtract 27. What happens when I add 10 to each of those numbers? Does the distance stay the same between them, or is it different? So the distance between them stays the same if we add the same amount to each number, right? 91, I'm going to add 10 to it, and I'm going to add 10 to 27, which gives me 37. My neighbor is going to move away. Well, I've never spoken. And that's what it looks like visually for kids. So it's important that they have a model or an understanding. Place value is great too. And many of you will have dealt with place value at home. Do you remember this question way back at the beginning of the session? If I subtract the same amount from each number, the distance between them remains the same, which is really the answer. What happens if I take away 1 from each of those? I don't have to borrow. Conceptually, this is the same answer. It's 13 still. Okay, so how are we doing this in our classrooms? How many of you have heard of number talks? Your homework is to go home and ask your children if they're doing number talks in their classrooms, because they should be. They should be. We started putting them in our classrooms last year, and they need to be in classrooms. And number talks means a very short period of time of a day or a couple of times a week where kids are coming together and having an opportunity to look at number and start working flexibly and sharing ideas. So what would happen is that you would be in a classroom and you would come to an area where the desk is not in front of you, hopefully, because what we found in research is that the desk is a barrier between you thinking and that question on the board. So there's some research around that. So ideally, you're all up in a close spot. We're having a conversation. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a number talk right now. I'm going to model it for you. So I'd like you all to have a closed fist on your chest. And what that tells me as a teacher is that you're thinking. And I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do that, think about when you were in a mathematics classroom. And think about the child that's at the front or the child that has the answer first, and they've got their hand up and they're going like this, I know it, I know it. Right away you're thinking you're done. Oh, they've got the answer again. I'm out. I'm done. Here, it gives everyone time to think. And as a teacher, I'm looking and I can say, okay, everyone's thinking. And so what I'd like you to do is to look at the dots on the screen. And I'd like you to count how many dots you see. And when you see the number of dots, you're going to stick your thumb up because you've got a certain number of dots that you see in your head or that you see on the board. If you see it in more than one way, so the child that gets the answer very quickly is now going to look for a different way. Do I see it differently? And they're going to go like this. So now I see it in 2 ways. And what that also does for me as a teacher is it shows me who's got an answer so that I can ask them when they're ready to go, and who doesn't so that I can ask them later on. Okay? Which is really important to have that safe space to learn. So the question was, nowadays most kids are sitting in groups. So they're not sitting in rows anymore. They might be in groups, table groups of 4. How does this work in those table groups? It doesn't. I'm either all going to turn my chairs to face the same way, or I'm going to find a spot in the classroom where we all come together that's not even at the desks. Ideally. Okay? So I'm going to ask someone, if you could just put your hand up just so I can see. I don't want to point anyone up. Anyone see 10? Okay, so who would like to share how they saw 10? Yes. Okay, so what you told me is you saw 4, and you saw another 4, and you said 4 plus 4 is 8, right? And you knew that was 8, and then you added 1 and 1. Did you add 1? Did you start with 8 and then go plus 1 is 9, plus 1 is 10, or did you do 8 and 2? So she got 10 seeing that. So as a teacher, it's important that I'm going to be able to understand what she's saying and represent it as a picture as well as numbers. Another way, yes?
This is the way you are teaching it at school, so you know that each kid how he's thinking or how she's thinking?
So the idea of this specific number talk, the question was, is this how you're teaching at school to know how the kids are thinking? This is one way. It tells me a lot about how she's thinking. I know she sees 4 and 4. I know that she adds the 2 at the end and she gets 10. This activity specifically really helps kids get to understand the routines of what a number talk would be. So every student can be part of this and they can get 10, right? So this is just a model. Yes, my dear. How did you get 10?
I saw 6 and 4 and I saw automatic 10 and then 5 and 5 was also automatic 10.
She saw it 2 ways. So she saw 6 and you saw 4. So you saw these 2 and these 2 together? Or did you see 6, 2, and 2? So you saw 6 and 4. And you knew that was automatically 10. And you said you also saw 5 and 5?
Yes, 3, 2. Yes, 5.
So you saw 5. Is that how you saw 5 and 5? So there are many ways of seeing 10 here. And again, what's happening is, yes, 10 is important. We want all kids to see that there are 10 dots. But guess what? We've just recognized different ways of building 10. We know 10 can be made of 4 and 4 and 2, or 10 can be made of 5 and 5, or 6 and 4. And what's happening is kids are starting to look at different ways that other kids are doing it and saying, oh, you know what? That works a lot better for me than this way. So it's giving them an opportunity to see different ways of thinking, so how do I pull those numbers apart? How many of your children are on Dreambox? Okay, so Dreambox is a program in mathematics. There is actually a webcast at our board website that talks specifically about Dreambox and how it fits in with mathematics. Dreambox is different than every other math program out there because it looks at the question, it looks at the answer, but it looks at how the child got the answer. I will walk into any classroom in our board that is using Dreambox, and no kid, no 2 children will get the same next screen. Every other program that's out there, Prodigy, all the gimmick ones that are out there, they have, everyone gets the same answer, everyone gets the same next screen. Same answer, same next screen. This one will tell me how kids are counting. So you know, remember that number line one where you're moving back and forth? So if a kid's moving it over 15 spots to try and get their answer, that's going to give Dreambox some information. Now, Dreambox isn't our teacher. Dreambox is using the models that we're using in our classroom to support kids in developing number sense. So let's go back to that number talk. We're going to do another number talk. Hands up. This is called a 10 frame. It's on Dreambox, and they're also in our classrooms, and there's a picture of what it looks like in our classrooms. There's actually physical models. So once you know how many dots there are, put your thumb up, please. If you see it in more than one way. Yes, sir. That's you. How many dots do you see?
I see 8.
You see 8. How did you see 8?
There's 4 there, and there's 4 in the other one too.
There's 4 there, and there's 4 in the other ones. Did you see a group of 4 that looks like a square first?
Yeah.
And then you count it up and over? So 4 and 4 is 8. Did anyone see something different? Yes.
I saw 5 plus 3.
I saw 5 and 3. So she sees 5 right away, and then another 3 more. Yes. 6 and 2. So sees the group of 6 on the left-hand side, and then the 2 horizontal. So many different ways. And kids are listening to each other and how they're seeing those numbers. Another tool is what's called a math rack. And the difference between these two, they're both on Dreambox, but they're also in our classrooms. It's not just about the program, it's about the tools that are in our classrooms. See this one? This one builds to 20. So what will happen is kids will learn to build to 5 first, then they build to 10 using a 10 frame, and then we start with, remember that's really important that they can add and subtract to 20? So then they build to 20. So when you're looking at that, hopefully it's really easy for you to see that 5 right away in red, 5 right away in white. We don't want kids counting by ones. We want them to be able to do, so Dreambox might say, show me 13. And I might push 10 across and 3 across. Sorry, that's 14. 10 across and 4 across. I only did it in 2 pushes. That tells me a lot about what I know. Yes, the number of pushes that I take on this tool tells me how I know numbers. So if I'm counting by ones to get to 14, that's taking me a long time. I should see 5 and 4, or I see 10 and 4, or I see 14 immediately. Yes? So I want you to put your hands here while I get my paper ready. This is in your head. When you get the answer, I'll see your thumb. Someone like to share the answer? 80? Anyone get 80? Okay. How did you get 80? If you could share that, that would be helpful. Yes? So you did 5 times 10 and 5 times 6. Okay, so you've broken that number apart. You've worked really flexibly with that number. I've got 10. She knows that 10 and 6 make up 16. So 5 times 10 is 50. 5 times 6, and I apologize if it's really small back there. 5 times 6 is 30. 50 and 30 is 80. This is called an array. And an array, an open array, helps me to visualize or understand multiplication. Just like we had that number line from addition, subtraction, multiplication, we move to arrays. Okay, so those are also tools that your child should be using. Anyone have a different way of doing it, sir? 16 is 8 and 8.
Yeah.
That's what I want to be talking about. That's good. So there's 40, 40, which is 80. And that one's a lot easier for me to represent. Okay. So please know, though, when your child's starting to learn multiplication, let's say they're in grade 4 and they're learning 3 times 2, because it's a concept. I don't stick 3 times 2 at them. What does 3 times 2 mean? It might mean 3 groups of 2. I need to see 3 groups of 2. That's what the multiplication is. And eventually I'll move to something where I can do 3 groups of 2 in an open array. So I can think about that that is 3 groups of 2, but I'm starting with little concept of grouping. So these are different ways that you may have thought about. Yes, ma'am? The doubling and halving. The last one was also one where you might have done 5 times 20, take away 4 times 5. You knew that number. So these are some of the benefits I talked about in terms of those number talks. Again, it's important that a child knows why are they important. Hopefully you've found some ways that they're important just for your own thinking, how it's helped you think about some of the number pieces. Think about 2 digits. So how do we take something that's 16 times 5 and extend it? Well, let's think about 28 times 43. Right away, what's our go-to? We'll line them up and we'll go through the algorithm that we understand, right? And so you'll be at home and that's what you'll be trying to do. And your child might be confused or they might not, but let them show you. Don't show them, let them show you. And ask questions. So think about that. What does 28 really mean? It means 20 and 8. What does 43 really mean? 40 and 3. So using this array model, we're able to move to something a lot more complex. Now, is that going to be efficient as we get older and older and are working with multiplying 2-digit numbers? We're going to eventually lose that model. But I don't have to memorize anything. I can always get the answer. I have a way of attacking that problem. And so for those of you that can't see on the side, I apologize. Hopefully you'll see where those numbers are related in that lining up of adding them all together. That's not the algorithm that many of us use, but it leads us there. And then we'll try to get more efficient. Is there a faster way we can do this? And kids will start to work at their pace, and we'll try to move them to that algorithm that we know. Okay, algebra. So now that model, I know that many of you are here in you have children in grades 7 and 8. That's important. Because guess what? They're going to start to work with algebra, and algebra variables. So having been a high school math teacher in grade 9, they are multiplying x by x. Do you remember that? You multiplied x by x, and you're like, what is x? I have no idea. Well, there's 2 things that kids will come up with. They're either going to tell me it's x squared, or they're going to tell me it's 2x. Because they've memorized it. Instead of thinking about what is x times x? Oh, guess what? It's an x squared. If the side length is x and the width is x, x times x gives me a square. It's x squared if they're the same length. It's the same length, which is x, and across the top, let's call it 1. That's what an x looks like. These are called algebra tiles, and if your kids are in high school, you want them to have experience with algebra tiles. It doesn't mean that they're going to be dependent on algebra tiles forever, but I guarantee you that they know the difference between 2x and x squared. It's pretty important. You have a book in front of you. If you have children kindergarten through grade 6, you probably already get these every year in the backpack. It gets sent home with all the other papers that come home at the beginning of the year. These are great activities that you can do with your children. Pick a time. Pick every 2 weeks. Grab one of the activities out of there. Do them. Don't pull it out with the child with the blue book and they're going, oh no, here they come, they've got that blue book again. Look at some of the activities. Okay, today we're going to bake. Or we're going to go and look at pricing in a store. Look at some of the things that you can do with your child. Your job is not the teacher. You don't have to teach your children. Your job is the advocate for your child. And your job is to listen to your children. Have them explain to you. Ask them things like, are there numbers that doesn't work for? That's really higher order thinking. Can you make up a question for me so I can try it? That's really good for parents, for kids to do. You make up a question and I'm going to try it. Tell me if I'm doing it right. This is what I do. Very helpful. There are some other websites that are for parents, mathies.ca, and it's a new website produced by the province. For those of you that have children in 7, 8, or secondary, there are a couple of resources there. One of them on the right is, there's a blue document, you'll see it when you get to the page. The Home Connections, it has stuff for 7, 8, 9, 10. They're not in the book. It's really important that if your child gets stuck in homework or is frustrated, you have that conversation or communication with the teacher, you know. We were working on this because you are here. You are here to help your child. You're here to try and partner with schools. You're here for your kids. You're here for the system, I think. You want to hear that we're doing good things together. So your job is to say, they got really frustrated on question 3A. Can you help them? Because you're not the teacher. That's not your job. You have, unless you are a teacher, go for it. And if you feel that you're comfortable helping, go for it. But don't feel that we're expecting you to be the teacher. We're expecting you to say, you know what, my child's doing, like really enjoyed that homework last night, or really did well on this. They felt so confident and proud of themselves. That's great communication too. So have those conversations. Yes?
Can you speak to the difference between Math Makes Sense books and Jump Math books?
So Jump Math is another program that we do not support as a board. Jump Math is a program, it is a booklet that you can buy, and it has a series of steps and procedures at the top of each page, and your child follows those questions and does the exact same steps and procedures as they go through. And they probably are good. They probably get them done. So remember all that talk about steps and procedures and how much space children have in their brain? There's only so much space to memorize all these things. Guess what? Go back to a page that they did in September, open it and see how they do. So that's a conversation. And you can say, Mrs. Blackwell said, we're no longer, I've messaged to the system. So I'm okay with saying that. We do not support Jump Math. We do not promote Prodigy in our board. And so when I hear this, it makes me very sad. The thing around Math Makes Sense workbooks, we get a lot of parents that want those workbooks coming home. You don't have to put your hand up if you are or are not. So that goes back to that question around homework. What is good homework? And one of the things around saying that, you know, Math Makes Sense workbooks shouldn't be your homework book, they shouldn't be. They're a great use. There's some great problems in them. Take them, send them home, say, try this, page 17, number 4 today. That's your homework. The thing is, if we say to, as we work with our teachers to really get better at what is good homework so that parents and students feel confident about what's coming home, one of the things that we want to be leery of is if we take something away, what's it being replaced with? So I could put a message to the system and say, I don't want Math Makes Sense workbooks going home because it's just drill and kill. And it's just more of the same stuff that they were doing in class. But what might happen is I might get www.math.com worksheets being photocopied and sent home. So there's a lot of teachers that use Math Makes Sense workbooks in a really good way. Like you might see it once a week, it might be a couple of questions. If it's coming home every single night as the program, I'd be asking questions around, help me understand how this is being used in class. Yeah. So the question was, how long have we been doing this math program in Halton? And the second part is, how do we compare to other places in the world? So there are a couple of things that we started a math plan 3 years ago in our board to strategically go after number sense. Not that we're not teaching other pieces of mathematics. And our board supported with dollars and with resources to our schools as well as professional learning for our teachers. The curriculum hasn't changed since 2005. We're teaching the same curriculum. But how we're teaching it and the focus in terms of, are we using models to represent student thinking? It's new, 2 years. Last year was the first year that we said you should be doing number talks in your classrooms, and I'm still finding that there are classrooms that are just starting, but we've aligned as well professional learning with that in our board. We offer 5-part series for teachers, and they fill up in 20 minutes. Our teachers are very keen, they're very excited about the stuff that we're doing, and they're really becoming better at supporting students in developing their ability to work with numbers. That being said, we have a lot of other things to go after. Number sense leads to working with algebra. Whatever works with numbers works with letters. That was that last little bit. So algebraic thinking is important, algebraic reasoning, spatial reasoning. We have lots to go after, but our teachers and our board are committed to that learning that goes with it. So in some schools, in some classrooms, all over it. In other, just starting, but the expectation, and we've got principals learning at the same time. So they're learning what they should be looking for in classrooms and what are the questions that they should be asking of the students in those classrooms, because they'll tell us a lot. So I hope I answered that question. In terms of where we are in Ontario, I can't compare what we do in our board internationally. I don't have a comparison tool, but PISA looks at Ontario, and we are dealing with the Ontario measures. So we are doing probably about 10th on PISA, and as a board we do quite well in EQAO, but hopefully we'll see a significant increase in our grade 6s this upcoming session, because it's been a couple of years, right? So we're looking to that data. Yep. So epractice.ca is a free online tool for 7 to 10. As well, there is something called Homework Helpline, and it's run through the Independent Learning Center for any parent. Your child has free access to it for homework help for grades 7 through 10. It's fabulous. There's a certified teacher on the other end, and they're able to ask questions while they're doing homework at any time. It's phenomenal. It's like having your own free tutor. 7 to 10? It's only math, yes. One more resource that I forgot about is brand new. It is for parents, written by the Council of Directors of Ontario. And it has modules, it has little video as to helping your child at different levels. And it does have one for grades 7 and 8, module 5. It was just released last week. It gives you ideas of ways that you can sit with your child and talk about mathematics and help them, not necessarily teaching them the math, but it's a fabulous new resource, and it was written directly for parents. Yes? I would like to share, with a board perspective, I'd like to share things as to what are your kids doing in class, because that's going to help you understand what they're learning.